The former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was in a US prison charged with smuggling 400 tons of cocaine into the United States. But just ahead of a very tense presidential election in Honduras, President Trump announced he was going to pardon Mr Hernandez.
That was a Biden horrible witch hunt. A lot of people in Honduras asked me to do that, and I did it. I feel very good about it.
Meanwhile, the US has seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela as it continues to pile pressure on the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro. The US government accuses Mr Maduro of trafficking drugs into the United States, something which Mr Maduro denies. So what is behind this seemingly contradictory, conflicting strategy in Honduras and Venezuela and beyond?
Nicolas Maduro comes from the Latin American socialist tradition, whereas Hernandez is from the Latin American conservative tradition. Trump sees him as more aligned with his ideology.
I'm Geraint Vincent, and this is what you need to know. Well, our reporter Will Tullis is here with me, and he's been looking at this. Will, first things first, who is Juan Orlando Hernandez?
Yeah, so a short history, Geraint. Juan Orlando Hernandez is the former president of Honduras. He served from 2014 until 2022. And at first it was all happy families with the US, who are obviously the biggest regional player for all the Central American countries. Barack Obama actually described Hernandez as an excellent partner for helping to curb migration into the United States from Honduras and Central America. But Hernandez is accused, charges he's always strenuously denied, of, during his time in power, facilitating what US prosecutors have called the paving of a cocaine superhighway into the United States. So what does that mean, a cocaine superhighway? Essentially, Hernandez is accused of taking bribes from the cartels to allow cocaine to move freely through Honduras and into the United States, 400 tons of cocaine. So when Hernandez left power in 2022, in the weeks after he was arrested by US prosecutors, US law enforcement, extradited to the US and tried in a US court, he was then sentenced to 45 years in prison for that plot and for smuggling all that cocaine into the United States. He was also sentenced for possessing what prosecutors called destructive devices. That includes AK-47s and machine guns. And he was also accused and charged of accepting a $1 million bribe from the notorious drug lord El Chapo, the Mexican drug lord too, who is now also serving time in an American prison. So I mentioned US prosecutors, US courts, US law enforcement. That's one of the contentious things about this, Geraint. In Central America, it's been kind of condescendingly described by Americans as the United States' backyard. And a lot of people in Honduras are frustrated that their former leader has been tried by American courts and was serving time in American courts. But as you said, recently, Donald Trump remarkably decided to pardon Juan Orlando Hernandez, and we've got a clip of him speaking about that now.
He was the president, and they had some drugs being sold in their country, and because he was the president, they went after him. That was a Biden horrible witch hunt, which was, a lot of people in Honduras asked me to do that, and I did it. I feel very good about it. If you have some drug dealers in your country and you're the president, you don't necessarily put the president in jail for 45 years. That was a Biden-inspired witch hunt.
Okay, so he's blaming it on Biden there, and Biden got it wrong. But what was Donald Trump's motivation for pardoning Mr Hernandez?
Let's address the Biden factor first. Joe Biden is absolutely loathed by Donald Trump. He's the guy that ran against Trump in 2020 and won and prevented Trump from serving 2 consecutive terms in an election that Trump calls rigged. So I think this is seen as a sort of middle finger to Biden. This was a Biden stitch-up. I'm pardoning this guy. I'm saving him from justice from Biden. Juan Orlando Hernandez wrote a letter to Donald Trump begging for a pardon, and it was playing to all of the things Trump's looks for. It's incredibly deferential, using incredibly deferential language.
Tried and tested technique the world over.
Absolutely, as we've seen time and time again, sucking up to him, really, to put it mildly, and saying he was the victim of a political persecution by Biden and Harris. So no surprise that really resonated with Trump. So I think that's one factor at play. Mm-hmm. I think The second factor at play as well is that Honduras is currently going through an election, and Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, his social media platform, and has spoken decisively saying, you must back my candidate, Tito Asfura, who's a conservative candidate who comes from the same party as Juan Orlando Hernandez. So you can see that Trump was essentially, some analysts are saying Trump was trying to pardon Hernandez to give Asfura, his preferred candidate, the horse he's backing, a boost in the polls. And it looks like that's actually happened. It's a knife-edge election in Honduras, but since Donald Trump's intervention and endorsement of Asfura, and which coincided with the pardoning of Hernandez, we've actually seen a bounce for Asfura in the polls and him take the lead there.
And you mentioned the sort of annoyance in Honduras about the fact that Hernandez was kind of tried and dealt with in the United States rather than in Honduras. I mean, there must be some disquiet at the American president's explicit interference in their election.
Absolutely. So all parties now in this knife-edge election are accusing the United States of unacceptable interference and of rigging the election. And again, when we've had all this condescending rhetoric for decades, if not centuries, of Latin America being considered as the US backyard and so many US CIA-backed coups taking place in Latin America, many Hondurans are seeing this as another manifestation of that. But the reason why Trump's endorsement was so consequential is that there's 1.1 million Hondurans living in the United States. The economy of Honduras is incredibly reliant on remittances sent back from the Honduran diaspora from the United States to Honduras. And Honduras, crucially, is also really reliant on aid from the United States. And Donald Trump explicitly said he's not going to throw what he calls good after bad. In other words, he said he's not going to give aid if a left-wing candidate who he hasn't endorsed wins Honduras' election.
And Will, you've been talking to people in Washington about what's happening in Honduras, haven't you?
Yeah, so I've been speaking to the Washington office on Latin America's Central America director. Here's what she had to say.
I think his agenda is very aligned with the MAGA agenda, unfortunately. So, first of all, we expect a reversal on key human rights advances that Honduras had during the ruling party Libre. Many human rights defenders, environmental defenders, and journalists that for years have been harassed, killed, and so on in Honduras are right now under fear. Because they believe that they are going to be again as a target from this conservative party that has linkages with drug traffickers, but also has linkages with corrupt actors.
Yeah, so there's a long history of US intervention in Honduras and wider Latin America. There's been 11 coups in Honduras since 1945. So a lot of Hondurans feeling a bit of fatigue from what feels like yet more American intervention or influence on their democratic processes.
So while all this plays out in Honduras, Will, the US has seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, which it says was transporting sanctioned oil from Venezuela and Iran. Venezuela's called that an act of barefaced robbery and international piracy. Trump, meanwhile, accuses Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, of drug trafficking. It looks like he's taking a very different approach to him.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable, really. So Donald Trump says he believes Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, is the kingpin of what he calls a narco-terrorist plot to produce and smuggle cocaine and fentanyl into the United States in order to destabilize the United States. But the US government's own stats contradict that analysis and that reading of it. 90% of the cocaine that comes into the United States comes over the border from Mexico, having been produced in Colombia, and the overwhelming majority of the fentanyl that comes into the United States is Mexico produced and comes over that land border too. And Nicolas Maduro strongly denies those accusations. As you said, it's a bit confusing and contradictory, really. He's pardoned a guy who has been found guilty by his own prosecutors, US prosecutors, of smuggling 400 tons of cocaine into the United States. But a guy who there's not really that much evidence of him being that involved in large quantities of cocaine and drugs entering the United States, he's pursuing with all this incredible military might off the coast. So what's going on here? And I mean, what a lot of people are saying is this is to do with political ideology. Nicolas Maduro comes from the Latin American socialist tradition. He's a successor of Hugo Chavez, who came to power from an election having tried to launch a socialist coup and being imprisoned for that a few years before, whereas Hernandez is from the Latin American conservative tradition. Trump sees him as more aligned with his ideology. And it's interesting to see that across the region now, Trump is building alliances with a Latin American, Western Hemisphere conservative bloc. You see Javier Milei, the chainsaw-wielding populist president of Argentina, who Trump bailed out to the tune of 20 billion, rising to 40 billion US dollars before his recent midterms. And Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who comes from that conservative tradition, who recently opened that notorious mega prison there that US prisoners and alleged gang members are being deported to. So, I mean, analysts are saying that Trump sees Asfura and Hernandez, who he's just pardoned, as potential allies in that conservative bloc against the greater evil in his eyes, which is Latin American socialism.
Okay, but I mean, there are some elements of. I mean, Trump's accusations against Maduro are not entirely without basis, are they? There is lots of evidence that he and his lieutenants are involved in the drug trade to some extent. I mean, Joe Biden issued arrest warrants for Maduro and I think his internal affairs, his interior minister. 5-6 years ago, didn't they? So I mean, there's some justification for...
Absolutely. There's absolutely no denying that Nicolas Maduro is a dictator. He's a pariah. He's suppressed the democratic process in Venezuela. He's jailed opposition candidates. And he's siphoned off hundreds of billions of dollars, by some estimates, from the public purses in Venezuela for his own benefit and for the benefit of his cronies. And he's turned a blind eye to some paramilitary and cartel operations in his country as a means to staying in power. However, what is up for debate is this dubious basis Trump says he's pursuing Maduro on, saying he's the kingpin of this narco operation, which, you know, there's sort of quite dubious evidence. There are some drug operations going on in Venezuela, but not to the extent you're seeing in Honduras and what Juan Orlando Hernandez was charged with and now has been pardoned for.
Sure, and you made reference to, I think, what the documents, the national security strategy, wasn't it? I had a quick look at some of it in preparation for our conversation, Will. It talks about targeted deployments to secure the border and defeat the cartels, including where necessary the use of lethal force to replace the failed law enforcement only strategy of the last several decades. And again, that can't be denied. The American governments have talked about a war on drugs and doing something about the drugs trade in Central and South America for years and years. And, you know, they are applying lethal force now. But again, you could argue that there was some justification from the Trump White House's point of view for, you know, finally cracking down hard on the people that facilitate this trade.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, Geraint. I think that's the reason Trump is trying to portray this as a narco war. He's trying to sell this to his base as the reason I'm intervening in Venezuela is because I don't want drugs pouring into our country and harming Americans. Because, you know, he was elected on a platform of, I'm going to end the forever wars, I'm not going to meddle abroad. So that's his way of trying to justify it. When actually it's pretty dubious and questionable whether his actions in those deployments and focusing on those areas with all that military might, at great cost to the American government, by the way, each day that those troops are deployed there, is actually having any tangible effects. And we saw the war on drugs in the Nixon and Reagan years. Yeah. You know, they were doing these big busts, but was it actually having any profound effect on those operations? Some would really question that. And when the US is the biggest market for cocaine in the world as well, some in Latin America are saying, how dare you talk down to us? It's your own people that are fueling this trade and this industry.
And as you mentioned, what we're seeing in some ways is a kind of replication of previous American government strategy, which is trying to get leaders who are going to do what the US tells them to do in place across the region, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned the national security strategy, because in that, as I'm sure you read, Trump said that he's pivoting his strategic vision and strategic priority to the Western Hemisphere. He wants the rebirth or the reinvigoration of what's known as the Monroe Doctrine that came in under President James Monroe, the fifth president of the United States in the
Now you're showing off now.
in the early 19th century. So basically what Monroe wanted, that initially started out as, we don't want any Europeans,
Interference.
aka the United Kingdom and France, interfering in our hemisphere. This is our hemisphere. That kind of evolved into the US sort of bossing around that hemisphere, in the sort of Henry Kissinger, Nixon era, sort of funding coups and all sorts of intervention and stuff. So as I already mentioned, that conservative bloc he's trying to construct in the Western Hemisphere, I think another priority for him is migration too. He was elected on a platform of cracking down hard on illegal immigration. That has been pretty successful. Border crossings are down to really minuscule numbers now, but some would say at what cost? We've been seeing really brutal scenes of those immigration enforcement, ICE deportations in the United States now. But I think Trump thinks if he can get conservative allies on side in Honduras and the wider region, that will stop people migrating up to the United States. And, having allies in his backyard, as we keep mentioning, is no bad thing for him.
Really interesting talking to you, Will. Thank you very much. And for the latest news and analysis, you can head to itv.com/news. And remember to subscribe to the ITV News YouTube channel. Until next time, thank you for listening.